Hello, Facebook, YouTube, internets. Welcome to Deleted Scenes. My name is Matt Holmes. I am the senior pastor here at Turner Christian Church. Yesterday, we started a new series on the parables of Jesus. And for the Deleted Scenes today, I thought I would actually address a question that I was asked right after the sermon. I feel like I didn't address it well in the moment, and it was a valid question, so I want to address this. In the sermon, I talked about the structure of the Gospel of Matthew and how when Jesus preaches, it's my opinion that when Jesus begins preaching in parables in the Gospel of Matthew, it's in response to the fact that people are turning against him. And so he changes the way that he teaches in order to address this new reaction that he's getting from people. And after the sermon, someone came up to me and said, I didn't see that claim in the passage. I don't see where it says that he started preaching in parables in response to people's opposition, to people disagreeing with him. And that's fair, because there isn't a verse where Jesus says, because people are rejecting me, I'm going to speak in parables. But that doesn't mean that my interpretation of the passage is just made up or is just entirely imaginary. It's actually based on a broader level interpretation of the book. I was going to say higher, but that I don't want that to sound like it's more sophisticated or anything like that. Higher in the sense that it's at a broader scope. It's looking at bigger chunks of the Bible. Here's one of the problems that we have as Christians, as Western Christians in the 21st century. We are so used to viewing the Bible in bite-sized chunks. And so we do everything in our Bibles that we can to break it up into chunks. So if you look at a typical Bible, you will see verse numbers, you will see chapter numbers, you will see notes on different paragraphs. I mean, all of this stuff. And all of that we add to the Bible, what we're doing is we're trying to turn the Bible into bite-sized chunks for us to work with. That's not the way the Bible was written. That's all stuff we've added. And it's helpful stuff. It's not like it ruins the Bible, but it gets us thinking in certain ways. And especially when you deal with the Gospels, because the Gospels tell all these different stories about Jesus, but some of them are the Gospels share some stories, some of them aren't in all of them. They're in different orders. And so and typically our main engagement with the Gospels tends to be a sermon or a lesson where you take one story and you focus on that story. And then the next week you'll do another story. And so we view the Gospel in these chunks. And so it's very natural then to look at the passage that I covered in Matthew 13 and say, look, he never says that his parables are a response to opposition, because that's not the conversation that they're having in chapter 13. The problem with this approach is that it misses the fact that the Gospels were not written in episode chunks. If you were to read the original manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew, it would just be a string of letters. No paragraph breaks, no sentence breaks, no verse breaks. It just keeps going on. And all of those chunks that we carve out of it are artificially made. And when you read the Gospels in a bigger chunk, you start to see things that you wouldn't normally see if you only look at it in small pieces. And if you read the Gospels all the way through, each Gospel presents you with a different perspective on Jesus. Not disagreeing perspectives, but just different views. And so what I want to do, first of all, is I want to make my case for why I interpreted the Gospel of Matthew to be working this way. And then I'm going to show you the basic structures of the four Gospels. And then I'm going to give you some pointers on how you can start seeing this yourself. And because you may read it and find different themes going on. And not all Bible readers agree on what the themes are. But let me give you the three things that I see to back up my interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew. The first thing that I want to point out is passage clusters. And here's what I mean. If you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all contain a lot of different stories, but they're in different orders and they're in different chunks. And if you read them in chunks, you'll notice that they're what Matthew, or each of them, will put their passages together based around certain themes. So, Matthew you have the Sermon on the Mount, which it could have been one. Some scholars believe it was a single sermon. Some people believe that that Matthew took a whole bunch of Jesus' teachings and combined it into one sermon. Then from chapters 8 and 9, you have a whole bunch of healing stories. And in chapter 10, chapter 10, 11, and 12, you have other stories of Jesus' ministry, and rejection stories tends to be the theme. And then in 13, you have an entire chapter that's a bunch of parables. So you notice that the passages tend to be clustered around common themes. And this was actually a very common way to write stories, histories back then. It was very common, if you read a biography written during this time period, that it wouldn't necessarily be written in chronological order, but the stories would be clustered together in themes. Now, in Matthew, it's very interesting that Matthew has 5 main clusters of Jesus's teachings, and which he's writing to a Jewish audience. So a lot of scholars think that that's meant to reflect the 5 books of the Torah. And you'll notice that in the first cluster is the Sermon on the Mount. The second cluster is the instructions that Jesus gives to his disciples in Matthew 10 when he's sending them out to preach the gospel. So those first 2 are pretty direct. The last 3 of Jesus's clusters of teachings are almost entirely parable. So you've got these 2 teachings are first, and they tend to be all direct and very little parable. And then these 3 are almost entirely parable. So you notice that Matthew separates these out. Now, if you go into Mark, and Luke, they don't separate them out that way. They have them mixed around in different themes. So clearly, Matthew had a reason for clustering them in this way. Okay? And as we taught in the next week's sermon, when we cover the rest of the parables in chapter 13, you'll really see a theme for the parables that he clustered together in chapter 13. Now, the second piece of evidence that I want to, if we add on to the passage clusters, we also have plot structures. You'll notice that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they each put events together in particular ways. A plot is basically a series of events that are arranged in an order to tell a logical story. And again, as you notice the way Matthew groups things together, he tends to group together the stories of people being healed by Jesus, of these really victorious healings and miracles and things like that. Those are in chapters 8 and 9. And then these stories about people rejecting Jesus, they begin in 10, and they're really clustered in 11 and 12, and the intensity of their opposition against Jesus grows over the story. So if you read the Gospel of Matthew, and it was your first time encountering the Gospel, the story of Jesus, you would see this mounting opposition to Jesus, and it really picks up steam right at the point where the first cluster of parables begins. So we've got clusters of teachings around certain themes, and then we have a structure to the plot where the opposition to Jesus is building. Finally, I want to point out the themes of the content, mainly the themes of the parables. The parables, all of them, tend to be addressing this basic idea of people rejecting Jesus, rejecting the kingdom. If you go back and you look at the parables that begin in chapter 13, then you've got them in chapter 18, chapter 20, and especially during Holy Week when Jesus is disputing with the Pharisees. Over and over again, you see that these parables have to do with how people respond to the kingdom. So whenever Jesus teaches about parables, he's teaching about how what happens when people reject the kingdom. And so when you put these together, you can see a pretty clear theme going on, all of these together, that he clusters passages together, he arranges the events in a plot, and then he puts those passage clusters in meaningful places in the plot, so that as the opposition to Jesus mounts, Jesus talks more and more about how people respond and what happens to people when they reject the gospel. When you put all of this together, it's true that you don't ever have a verse that simply says that Jesus started teaching in parables because people were rejecting him. But in the structure of the story, when you see that opposition is building to Jesus, and Jesus keeps talking more and more in the form of parables about people rejecting him, you can see that connection and see the plot build over the whole book. This is something that you won't see if you pull out just individual stories. But if you read the gospel through in big chunks or in one big chunk, you'll see these things build. It's kind of like if you take a movie and you watch any one particular scene, you're probably not going to get a sense of the whole plot of the movie. You may not get a sense of all of the themes in that movie. You'll get some of the characters and some of the ideas in it, but you won't get a sense for the whole movie unless you watch those plot points in sequence. Or if you watch one episode of a TV show, or maybe several episodes of a TV show, but you have one from season 2 and one from season 5 and one from season 3. Have you ever done that? Especially back in the days when you watched reruns instead of watching everything online, and you catch the episodes out of order and just get a weird sense for how the story's going. That's what happens if you read the Gospels in chunks without ever putting it all together. And when you do, you get this sense of the direction that the Gospels are going. Realizing this also helps us to understand why there's 4 different Gospels in the New Testament and why they don't agree, why they don't have things in the same order. Keeping in mind that in the time period in which the Gospels were written, they weren't expected to be necessarily in chronological order. They were expected to be in thematic order. And so you have 4 different Gospels that tell the story of Jesus in 4 different ways because they're emphasizing different themes and they're written for different purposes. So let's take a quick look. This is a very basic, you could go on and on in giving more detail in each of these, but in my opinion, this gives you the basic structure of the 4 different Gospels. We'll start with Mark because it's the shortest and most people think it's the earliest. It also is the simplest. If you read through Mark, you'll notice that over and over again, the theme that keeps coming up is people responding to this question: who do they think Jesus is? Over and over again, the story just keeps returning to this question, and you see different people answer the question in different ways. You see, people acknowledge who Jesus is. You see people reject Jesus. You see Peter at the center moment of the story acknowledges that Jesus is the Christ. And then you have all these questions about what kind of Messiah is he going to be? And the story builds and builds, and it crescendos at the cross when Jesus dies. And Mark really emphasizes this centurion. Out of all the Jews and all of God's people who've been watching Jesus throughout his life, there's this moment when Jesus dies, and a Roman centurion looks up at him and says, "Surely this was the Son of God." And then you go into the resurrection story, but it's really brief. It's cut off. Someone actually wrote another ending later on that got mixed up with the text, and that's why King James Version will have a longer ending. But if you go into modern translations, you'll see that they put that part in brackets. The ending is really abrupt, and you don't really see Jesus resurrected. You just see the empty tomb. And what that seems to do is it seems to put you on the spot to answer the question for yourself: who do you think Jesus is? It's a very cleverly written style. It's a cleverly written book. It's a great style that really makes you focus on who do you believe Jesus is. Now, Matthew, his theme tends to be focusing on Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. He quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel, and his theme, as we were looking at, really focuses in on Jesus's relationship with Israel. It emphasizes different events where Jesus fulfills the story of Israel, where he takes on the role of Israel. It also really focuses in on Jesus's relationship with the other Jews to explain how could a man who was rejected by the Jews claim to be the Jewish Messiah. And that's why so much of his gospel is focused on this question of the Jews rejecting Jesus. Because other Jews who are reading the gospel are going to say, wait, how could he be the Messiah if my synagogue doesn't believe in him? Matthew really keys in on that subject. Luke tends to focus on Jesus and his role in saving the downtrodden. Luke is the one who includes the story of Jesus announcing his ministry by reading from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me to proclaim good news to the poor. And over again throughout the Gospel of Luke, he seems to key in on Jesus connecting with people who are downtrodden. He connects with poor, with the sick, with Gentiles, with people that culture would generally not pay attention to. That's a recurring theme in his gospel. And then John is a whole different ball of wax, ball of yarn, whatever you want to call it, because he tells a whole different set of stories. But he really, really keys in on what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God. And he has these big chunks of Jesus' teachings and almost no parable. I don't think he has any parables. So he doesn't focus in on the parables like Matthew does. He focuses in on these long monologues from Jesus talking about his relationship with the Father and what it means for Jesus to really be the Son of God. Now, this doesn't mean that Luke, Matthew, and Mark didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. Not at all. But they had different topics that they were focusing on. They had different purposes. Mark really wants to force you to make a decision about who Jesus is. Matthew really wants you to know that Jesus came to fulfill the story of the Old Testament, what God has been doing ever since creation. Luke really wants you to know that Jesus is on the side of the downtrodden. And John wants you to understand that he's not just an ordinary man. He is God in human form. And all of them talk about all of these themes, but they each pick a different side. And so it's kind of like a diamond that you see from different angles, or like different paintings of the same person where it draws out different aspects of who they are and what they do. And so this is part of the reason why we have 4 biographies in the New Testament instead of just 1, and why it's important to be able to read them as their own independent books. Which leads me to my final point. How can you start to see these yourself? I think it's really important for us to read the Bible in multiple different ways. I think studying the Bible is great. Breaking it down sentence by sentence and trying to apply it to your life, that's great. But I think if you really want to fully understand the Bible, you need to do that. But you also need to just read the Bible in large chunks. You know, read an entire book of the Bible all the way through. Maybe not like, Numbers, but, Paul's letters, a lot of those are very short. You can read those in a single sitting. And you'll find when you start reading big chunks of the Bible, you get a different sense for the plot. And there's actually a really cool recent development that I want to show you. And these come in a lot of different forms, but they're called Reader's Bibles. This is an NIV version called the Books of the Bible. And what they've been doing in these Reader's Bibles is taking out all of the elements that distract you from the story. So these are the pages for Ezra and Nehemiah, and you'll notice that there's no verse numbers, there's no chapter numbers, and you can just read it straight through like a novel or like a poetry book. And it actually is surprisingly helpful. I know there are also some apps, some places online where you can read your Bible that way. Another good way to do this is to just use your phone, an app on your phone, and listen to an audio recording of the Bible. Any way that you can break your mind out of the verse by verse mindset and take it in bigger chunks. So I would recommend, take a gospel and read through it in as big a chunks as you can. You can also try outlining the plot yourself. And try and notice the themes that go through, the things that keep coming up. Do the same thing with books that aren't stories, like with Paul's letters. You can and ignore those little titles in the chapters that your translation gives you when you're doing this exercise, and figure out for yourself, what does this really mean? You can also, for another tool, if you want to get a more scholarly opinion, I've mentioned this a lot of times, so you probably know by now that I really like the Bible Project, and they do these kinds of outlines for every book of the Bible. You'll notice here that they have the 5 different chunks of the story labeled out. They do this with every book. You can find their videos on YouTube. I really recommend that because it's really helpful if you're a visual learner. But I think overall what I'm trying to say is I think you can find a whole different dimension to the Bible if you look at the overall structure and the overall plot of each book. And then there's a further level that we won't get into today, so I'll just tease you with it, which is that the entire Bible has an overall structure to it, an overall plot that each book fits into, so that when you read the whole thing together, you get another level to the story. And that's why reading the Bible is a lifelong project because you want to read it chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You also want to read it book by book and just the whole thing. And each time you do, you'll find more depth to the story. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope that was interesting for you. As we're going into the parables, I don't know that if there's going to be as much material for deleted scenes. So feel free, if you have any questions that you'd like me to address here, they can be attached. They can have something to do with the series that we're doing, or it could be just any question about the Bible. Feel free to message us with those, put it in the comments, or you'd like to do that. And as we go, I may start doing some deleted scenes, just focusing on those questions. Other than that, if you're local, we hope to see you at church. And if you're not, either way, we'd like to see you next week, same time, same place, for another Deleted Scenes. Thanks so much for watching.